The suitcase would not close. Margaret had packed and unpacked it 3 times already, and still it would not close. Harold watched her from the doorway of their bedroom. Their bedroom, the one with the window that faced the rose garden, the one where they had whispered to each other in the dark for 45 years, and he did not say a word. He simply watched his wife of half a century fold a blue cardigan with trembling hands and press it down into the corner of a suitcase that was never meant to hold an entire life. Daniel was waiting downstairs. Harold turned and looked at the wall beside the door. There was a small nail there, slightly crooked, that he had hammered in himself sometime in the late 1980s. Margaret's mother's clock had hung on that nail for 30 years. The clock was already packed, but the nail remained, and Harold stared at it the way a man stares at something he knows he will never see again. "Harold?" Margaret's voice was soft. "Come help me." He crossed the room and pressed the lid of the suitcase down with both hands while she worked the zipper around its edge. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. She did not look up. "It'll be all right," she said. She was not saying it to him. She was saying it to herself. He understood the difference. They carried the suitcases downstairs together, one step at a time. Daniel drove without music. The autumn countryside moved past the windows in long, quiet stretches of orange and gold, and Harold sat in the back seat with his hands folded in his lap, watching it pass the way a person watches something from a train, knowing they cannot stop it, knowing the distance is only growing. "It's just temporary," Daniel said again. His voice had the careful, flattened tone of a man who had rehearsed the words enough times that they had lost their meaning entirely. "Just until we get the finances sorted. You'll be comfortable there." Margaret was looking out her window. "Of course," she said gently. Harold said nothing. When the car turned off the highway onto a cracked side road and pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel, Harold felt something drop inside his chest. Not surprise, something worse than surprise, recognition. He had known, somewhere beneath the hoping, since the morning Daniel had first suggested this plan with the calm efficiency of a businessman closing a deal. He had known, and he had chosen not to know, because the alternative was something he was not ready to face. Daniel lifted both suitcases from the trunk and set them on the curb. He straightened up and looked briefly, very briefly, in their direction. Not quite at them, somewhere near them. "I'll call you in a few days," he said. "Get settled. It won't be long." He got in the car. He drove away. Harold and Margaret stood on that curb together in the thin autumn light, 2 small suitcases at their feet, and watched the car until it was gone. A truck passed on the highway behind them. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line. The motel sign hummed faintly above their heads. Margaret reached over and took Harold's hand. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Harold picked up both suitcases, one in each hand, and walked toward the motel office door, because there was nothing else to do, because that was the kind of man he was. You keep moving, you keep your hands busy, you do not sit down on the curb and break. Not yet. The room smelled of old carpet and stale air. The television worked only on certain channels. The single window faced the parking lot. Margaret stood in the center of the room for a moment, looking at it all with quiet, steady eyes, the way she used to look at a classroom at the start of a new school year, taking inventory, deciding what could be done with what was there. She opened her suitcase and placed her cardigan on the chair by the window. "We'll need groceries," she said. Harold sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin. "Yes," he said.
She went to the gas station across the road and came back with a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and 2 apples. They ate sitting side by side on the bed, and Harold thought about the kitchen table at home, the one he had built himself from reclaimed oak, and the way the morning light came through the window above the sink in winter. He thought about it the way you think about something you did not appreciate enough when you had it. 3 weeks passed. The $200 they had brought with them dissolved quietly, a few dollars at a time. Phone calls went to voicemail, messages went unanswered. One morning, Harold dialed Ryan's number and heard a recording telling him the line was no longer in service. He set the phone down on the nightstand and sat with his hands on his knees for a long while. Harold said he changed his number.
Margaret was at the window. She turned and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not quite sadness, not quite anger. Something older and quieter than both. "I know," she said. That night, Harold stared at the ceiling and thought about his hands. He spread them open in the dark and traced the familiar landscape of scars and calluses. A man who had built homes for other people. Framed walls, poured concrete, fitted windows, finished floors. He had built the kind of structures meant to shelter families for generations. And here he lay, in a $32 motel room, with no home and no money, and children who had stopped answering the phone. He closed his hands slowly. He made a decision. Margaret walked into the county records office the following Monday with the composure of a woman who had faced difficult rooms before. She explained their situation to the clerk simply and without apology. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, listened carefully and typed something into her computer. "There is one property," she said after a long pause. She turned the monitor slightly so Margaret could see. "Nobody's touched it in nearly 30 years. The photograph showed a squat, heavy building at the end of a dirt road, iron bars across every window, broken glass, walls stained by decades of weather. It had been a small county detention facility once, closed when a newer one was built across town. The county needed only the legal minimum to transfer the deed, $8. Margaret brought the photograph back to the motel room and set it on the bed in front of Harold. He leaned forward and studied it for a long time without speaking. His eyes moved over it the way they had always moved over a new job site, reading the bones, measuring the possibilities, asking the one question that had guided every project of his working life. "The foundation," he said quietly. "Look at those walls. That stone is solid." Margaret sat down beside him and looked at the picture again. The iron bars, the broken windows, the absolute ruin of the place. "Harold," she said softly, "are you sure?" He looked up at her, and for the first time since Daniel had driven away, something came back into his eyes, something certain and steady and unmistakably his. "I've built from worse," he said. She smiled, a small, real smile. "Then let's go buy ourselves a home for $8. Their first night inside the building was the coldest Harold had felt in years. Wind pushed through the broken windows and moved down the empty corridors like something lost. There was no electricity, no running water. The floor was concrete and the walls breathed cold. Harold spread their coats on the floor, and they lay down together beneath the remaining clothes from their suitcases, pulled over them like blankets. Margaret was quiet for a while. Then she got up, took a long strip of fabric she had torn from the lining of her suitcase, and tied it carefully across one of the iron bars of the nearest window. It hung there in the darkness, a small curtain, a ridiculous, beautiful, necessary curtain. "There," she said, sitting back down beside him. "That's better." Harold looked at it. He thought about all the windows he had framed and fitted and glazed in 40 years of work, and he thought that not one of them had ever meant more than this strip of fabric tied to a prison bar by a 74-year-old woman who refused to stop making a home. "Harold," he said. I'm sorry."
She laid down beside him and put her head against his shoulder. "Don't be," she said. "We're still here, both of us." He put his arm around her. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The fabric curtain stirred gently against the bar. He slept. In the morning, Harold walked every room with slow, deliberate steps, the way he had always begun a new project. 16 rooms, stone walls several inches thick, a roof with 2 weak sections but otherwise intact, a hand pump behind the building that Margaret spent an entire afternoon working back to life, a rusted toolbox in a storage room with a hammer, a saw, and a coffee can of old nails. He carried the toolbox to the largest room and set it down. He picked up the hammer, and he began. Iron bars were pried loose and bent into bed frames. Broken doors were repurposed into shelving. Scrap metal carried to a salvage yard came back as lumber and screws and lengths of pipe. Margaret cleaned every surface until her hands ached and then cleaned them again. Found an old tin bucket and used it to carry water from the pump. She organized their food on the shelf Harold built her. She made the place as clean and orderly as the classroom she had kept for 36 years. Word moved through the town the way it always does in small places, quietly, neighbor to neighbor, over fences and across diner counters. An elderly couple, the old detention building it by hand. A woman who ran the diner on Main Street drove out one Thursday afternoon with 2 wool blankets and a box of canned goods. She did not make a speech. She set them down, squeezed Margaret's hand, and drove back to town. A mechanic arrived the following Saturday with a truck bed full of tools. A farmer brought seasoned firewood. A retired electrician showed up on a Sunday morning and did not leave until real light burned in 3 of the rooms. Nobody asked for anything in return. Harold watched it all with the quiet bewilderment of a man unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of generosity. One evening, as a group of neighbors shared a meal in the largest room, he stepped outside alone and stood in the cold air looking up at the sky. He thought about Daniel, about Lena, about Ryan. He thought about the house, the porch he had built, the roses along the fence. And then he thought about the room behind him, warm and lit and full of the voices of people who had come out of simple human kindness. He did not feel anger. He felt something that surprised him, something that felt quietly like relief, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally, without quite realizing it, set it down. 6 months later, a county inspector arrived to assess the structure for demolition. He walked through the front door with his clipboard raised and stopped. Clean corridors, handmade furniture, curtains on every window, the smell of wood smoke and something warm from the back room where Margaret was making coffee. Children's drawings on one wall, left by the neighbor's grandchildren who had begun coming on weekends. The inspector walked slowly through every room. He did not write anything on his clipboard. When he came back to the entrance where Harold was waiting, he stood for a moment without speaking. "Mr. Bennett," he finally said, "what you've built here is something no one in this county expected." Harold looked around at the walls he had repaired, the floors he had leveled, the windows he had reglazed with salvaged glass. "I've been building things my whole life," Harold said. "I just never stopped." The inspector nodded slowly. He folded his paperwork. He did not order demolition. Harold and Margaret Bennett lost their house. They lost their savings. They lost, in the way that cuts most quietly, the children they had given everything to raise. But they never lost each other. And in the end, that was what everything had always rested on. Because home is not a deed or an address or a set of walls you recognize. Home is the person beside you when the walls are gone. It is the curtain tied to a prison bar in the dark. It is the hand that finds yours on a cold curb and holds on. They proved that a life built on love does not require permission to continue. It only requires two people willing to pick up the hammer one more time. The value within this story. This story carries lessons that matter deeply and endure long after the final word. It speaks to the quiet epidemic of elder abandonment, a reality millions of aging parents face in silence, without drama or news coverage, simply left behind by adult children too consumed by their own lives to look back. It teaches that dignity does not depend on circumstance. Harold and Margaret never begged, never surrendered their self-respect, and never stopped contributing. In their darkest moment, they created something of value for their entire community. It shows the transformative power of community kindness, that ordinary people, when they simply choose to show up, can change the outcome of another person's life completely. It reminds every viewer that the skills, the love, and the character you build over a lifetime belong to you. They cannot be taken away when a door closes or a car drives off. And most profoundly, it tells the truth about what a home really is. Not property, not square footage, not an address, but the presence of another human being who chooses to stay. If this story reached you today, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Share it with someone who needs to remember that they are not forgotten. And leave a comment below telling us what home means to you. Your words matter here, every single one.